Hello, welcome again to episode 5 of this podcast series we are doing with amazing fellows from the Legatum Center of Entrepreneurship at MIT. And of course, we're having very interesting conversation because these are entrepreneurs, they are founders who are building amazing products that are solving African challenges. And in this episode, I'm hosting TP. He told me to call him TP. So let me let him introduce himself and tell us just what he does.
No, all good. My name is Thapelo Motlogeloa. I'm from South Africa. I co-founded a company that's called the Pele Energy Group.
Mm-hmm.
We are primarily a renewable energy independent power producer. We started our company 15 years ago.
Oh, 15 years.
Yeah, it doesn't feel that long.
I know.
15 years
Yeah.
ago, we have about 1 gigawatts of power generating
Oh.
electricity onto the South African grid.
Mhm.
A range of utility scale solar, wind. We've just had a concentrated solar power project, which is solar with storage, but not using batteries, but using molten salt, CSP technology that was commissioned recently.
Yeah.
And we have another 1 gigawatt to 1.5 gigawatt at various stages of development, at a financial close, and at the construction phase.
Right.
Yes.
I love the space you're in because one of the things I do also on the side is just write about renewable energy and sustainability and all these things. And of course, we always read a lot of interesting stories from South Africa about, power issues and everything.
Sure.
But why renewable energy for you?
Yeah. So renewable energy, when we started the company, we realized and we knew that we were at the beginning of an energy transition.
Yeah.
From conventional power that was mainly provided by gas to power or by coal-fired power plants, right? And due to this huge energy transition that has led to climate change or contributing to climate change, and as well, our country, it was just after a year, 2 years into load shedding having started in South Africa, right? But the other macro change that was happening globally, and especially on the African continent, and something that we knew that is coming, is the deregulation of the power sector.
Yeah.
Traditionally, power has been provided. It started globally. It's still like that in most African countries. But a state is provided by a state utility, right? And we knew also at the time that a time is coming where, like telecoms, essentially the electricity sector would need to be deregulated, moving away from state utility providing all the power and introducing the private sector. So those two major shifts, actually we saw it, and just the elimination of carbon, just as one of the huge structural changes in the history of essentially humanity. Just like we discovered fire, then it was the steam engine, then it was electricity, especially via coal-fired power stations. And now this is the next energy transition. So it was also, of course, meeting the need, not only in South Africa, but, finally working on the hard problem and something that doesn't make sense in this century of why is Africa still referred to and why, when it's dark, why is most of this continent still black? Yeah.
And based on these shifts, I know one of the biggest thing, of course, I've read about, it's about regulations. We've seen, maybe the government talking about, how do we license people, even just install solar in the house, for example. So based on this, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges you faced just since starting building the product, 15 years ago and to where you are right now?
So one of the biggest challenges is, of course, attracting funding. But when you go to the right places, there's a lot of funding that is waiting to invest in infrastructure broadly, So for me, the bigger issue is coordinating along with our policymakers to finally ultimately get serious about building infrastructure, And part of that is creating the incentives through policy. But also, most importantly, it is, infrastructure, these are long-term projects, and it takes also entrepreneurs, people who provide funding, but they understand this because infrastructure has been funded globally, right? But our policymakers understanding that when you're a government, you know, building infrastructure is not a one-term government, you know, one political term. It is something that takes decades, you know. The average term of what in our industry is the main contractor purchase and power agreement is about 20, 25, 30 years, you know. And if you're talking nuclear, it's even longer than that, you know. So you need that sort of long-term planning. And for us and for Africa specifically, that is the outlook that we need to have, you know. The biggest challenge is working with policymakers and governments who have that long-term vision, and who then are incentivized and build incentives to have a strong legal system, you know, and to ensure that you lay the ground for systems that will continue and have the policy certainty that would execute infrastructure, not just 10 years, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, because that's what it takes.
Exactly. And actually be surprised, you know, working with governments who have that long-term vision. It's not just a South African thing, it's actually an African thing.
Yeah.
And we've seen that delay a lot of things actually, you know, across Africa. And, you know, I think that's why now, you know, partners like the Foundry Fellowship, you know, MIT come in. And when did you join the program? And why did you join the program?
So, for me, I was referred by a very close friend of mine. He was on the program last year. Similarly, he's in infrastructure. He's done education. He's done affordable housing, right? And we are essentially in the broader infrastructure space. Similarly, right? For me, I am at a pivotal moment in my career. Just as an entrepreneur in my general career, I'm at an inflection point, right? As South Africans, we are also fortunate in that relative to other growth markets and other countries in Africa, things are stable, relatively stable. We've got a deep pocket of funding that is not dollar-based, so that comes from the South African economy, you know? And for me, similar to my business partners, once we figured out how to actually do this, because I majored in economics, so I'm not an engineer or anything, you know. Because this problem, it wasn't just affecting South Africa, the broader continent more specifically, you know. It was like, we were building a company that would be able to develop, own, and operate power plants, not only in South Africa, but actually go to the rest of the continent, to other growth markets, and ultimately to other developed markets, you know. And the challenge and / opportunity is so huge that it's not only a few companies that can do it, you know. You actually need to mobilize a significant number of people, both in the private sector and in the public sector throughout the rest of the continent, to actually just bring about power onto the continent and just broadly bring about infrastructure. That's how we are going to industrialize, you know. So for me, I then saw the MIT program as another step in my career journey to be able to achieve that mission, you know, to meet other entrepreneurs in the ecosystem, and to be able to learn how to build ecosystems, so that we can work together more broadly and coordinate better to do this.
Right. And of course, in Nairobi, courtesy, of course, the MIT program. And of course, you know, I understand you've visited a lot of places, met a lot of entrepreneurs, studied, of course, the ecosystem, met a lot of leaders. You know, what would you say are some of the key takeaways or some of the important things you'll take home that you've seen actually, you know, happening here in Nairobi, here in Kenya, especially, you know, in regards to the ecosystem?
So for me, what has excited me about Kenya is the culture of entrepreneurship, you know. Of course, it is very fintech dominated, but I see Kenyans as very open-minded. I believe, and I see, as a person from the southern part of Africa, I admire, and maybe I could be wrong, how a bit more integrated Eastern Africa is, because you speak to people in Kenya and they move around and they operate throughout the region, you know, which is something not very common among South Africans, especially as we've got, of course, a lot of people coming, but it's not easy to actually find opportunities and actually execute outside of South Africa. A lot of our existing businesses and listed businesses have failed miserably whenever they've exited South Africa, you know?
Actually, that's true. We've seen a lot of South Africans that come into Kenya actually fail miserably.
Miserably.
Them,
Everywhere, you know, West Africa, and you know. So for me, what's excited me is the level of entrepreneurship, the warmth of the Kenyan people, and there is just so much opportunity, you know. But I've also learned the challenges, how maybe the impact of debt or donor funding, how you've been so innovative. Of course, everyone knows about Safaricom and M-Pesa, you know, but learning how do you leverage that into other industries, you know? But I guess for me, the biggest takeaway and what gets me excited is the number of young people who are creating in different sectors, you know, and who actually are even acquiring South African businesses. I've met 2 people who have acquired South African fintech companies, etc. So for me, that excites me, you know, and I hope, and in our program, there's a Kenyan who's been based in Zambia and has lived in Rwanda, etc. So for me, that's what I like. And for me, because I would like Africa to be a lot more integrated, where we can coordinate a bit more. I believe that is one of the things that is holding us back when you compare us to other regions.
I think that's the African dream that we all want, yeah? So I think, thank you so much. Any closing remarks?
Closing remarks, yeah, you know, to continue on that African dream, you know, it is beyond looking at the tribes that we come from, the countries that we come from. And I wish that even when it goes back to our policymakers, you know, and people in authority, the history of Africa, unfortunately, what you easily find and what is in the education system starts with colonization. But I wish that more and more of us could learn about African history pre-colonization, pre the Bible, you know, because that is actually what would shift our mind about what we are capable of and what we have done before.
All right, thank you so much. I think, you know, as you said, you know, as much as we are African, we still have so much to learn about Africa in general. So thank you so much for joining us, and of course, we look forward to just seeing what more you're building, and of course, talk more and just, again, as I said, learn more about what you're doing. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you so much for being with us on this episode. I'll see you in the next one.